My name is Chris Rosa, and I'm honored to serve as the President and CEO of the Viscardi Center in Albertson, Long Island, and I'm very proud to serve as your MC for today's proceedings. Today is a glorious day, a milestone moment, a celebration of the 32nd birthday of one of the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation ever enacted, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I have a little bit of a reputation. When I have a beautiful audience like you and a mic, there tends to be singing involved. So I cannot pass up this opportunity. Since it is the ADA's birthday, will you join me? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, ADA. Happy birthday to you. Give yourselves a round of applause. I genuinely feel the joy, and it's with that kind of unbridled joy, hope, and optimism for the future of the community of Nassau residents with disabilities that we're here today to celebrate the anniversary of this landmark legislation. And I can't think of a more appropriate setting for us to have this celebration and to celebrate the history of the ADA. This county courthouse is steeped in history. I'm proud to call Dan Looney my friend and colleague. He's the resident historian of this building, and he reminds me when we visit that this building was created in 1940, and it was modeled after the Lincoln Memorial. And as you look around, you see the striking resemblance to the Lincoln Memorial. And I think about the Lincoln Memorial today and what it represents, the commitment to justice, to civil rights, and to inclusion. And to the extent that this space inspires those same core values, it is the very heart of what we celebrate here today in the spirit of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Today we benchmark our progress. We clearly have a long way to go when it comes to true and meaningful inclusion of Americans with disabilities. But thanks to the Americans with Disabilities Act, we have made some very significant progress. For example, while the workforce participation rate of Americans with disabilities still stubbornly lingers around 33%, over the last 30 years, we've seen the unemployment rate among job seekers with disabilities cut in half. And that is a direct result, that is worthy of applause. That is the direct result of the practice of As an educator, I'm proud that this year, high school students with disabilities will graduate high school at a comparable rate to their non-disabled peers. And students with disabilities are enrolling in colleges and universities as a rate comparable to their non-disabled peers. And again, that is a result of the aspirations and hopes and dreams raised by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So let's please acknowledge that. And finally, in a recent Harrison Associates poll, 70% of Americans with disabilities feel as though their quality of life has improved significantly over the last 3 decades. And they attribute that progress to the impact and the protections of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So please, let's give a round of applause for those significant achievements. Today, we celebrate the Americans with Disabilities Act as a significant legal document which protects the rights and opportunities of Americans with disabilities to fully participate in all aspects of American life. We celebrate the ADA as a remarkable bipartisan achievement, which during these divided times seems almost unimaginable, but the ADA was enacted through broad bipartisan support on both sides of the aisle, signed into law by President George Bush in 1990. It was a true bipartisan achievement where all Americans came together and affirmed the full participation of people with disabilities in all aspects of American life, which embodies the core values of the American disability community and represents a moral consensus on how we agree as Americans we ought to regard people with disabilities. And so we'll begin first of all by the visionary definition of disability under the ADA. And the framers of the ADA were really forward-thinking and framed the ADA and who was protected not by some laundry list of conditions that warranted protection, but by a conceptual framework that was broad enough to imagine that the population of people with disabilities and who would need protection by the ADA would evolve over the course of time. And as the community of Americans with disabilities became increasingly diverse, that those individuals would be able to claim the same protections, the same civil rights as other people with disabilities. So what began as an act that largely covered the interests of people like me, wheelchair users, blind and low vision individuals, deaf and hard of hearing individuals, now proudly protects the rights of people with hidden disabilities, like people with cognitive and learning disabilities, people with mental health disabilities, with the burgeoning population of neurodiverse Americans, including people on the autism spectrum, and disabilities that we're now just coming to terms with and beginning to understand, like long-timers from COVID. All those individuals have their rights and opportunities and hopes and dreams protected and buoyed by the ADA. So the definition is really profound. Secondly, the concept of reasonable accommodations is remarkable in the sense that it is uniquely American. It's rooted in the principles of meritocracy. The core principle of reasonable accommodations says that for people with disabilities, if you remove barriers and you level the playing field, people with disabilities have an equal opportunity to succeed or fail, but purely on their merit alone. And that's all that Americans with disabilities ask, is an equal opportunity to compete based on their talents and abilities. And finally, what's in a name? It's significant that the Act is not the Americans with Special Needs Act or the Differently Abled Americans Act. It is the Americans with Disabilities Act. First and foremost, Americans with disabilities are Americans with the same hopes, dreams, fears, and aspirations of all other Americans. Yet, we are fiercely proud of our identity as people with disabilities. It reflects our community, it reflects our culture, and it reflects our history. And it's history that we are here to celebrate in a very meaningful way. And I'm very proud to say that as much as any other place in the United States, Nassau County is a real cradle for American disability history. Among the historic figures that Nassau County claims is Paul Hearn, graduate of the Henry Viscardi School, graduate of Hofstra University and Hofstra Law School, and the gentleman who went on to found the American Association of People with Disabilities, a proud Nassau County resident. Dr. Frank O, a distinguished faculty member at Hofstra University, authored a path-breaking book called Rehabilitating America, which provided the conceptual framework for the Rehabilitation Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which was really the first comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation upon which much of the ADA was modeled. And finally, the namesake of the organization that I'm proud to lead along with members of our board and the remarkable members of the Viscardi team. It's named after our namesake, Dr. Henry Viscardi Jr., who was really a precursor to the modern disability rights movement. I say that I could do him justice, but we have a small video here that we'd like to share with you where you get to hear Dr. Viscardi in his own words. Can we please continue that video? Thank you.
Henry Viscardi Jr. was born in New York City in 1912. Born without legs, Henry was relegated to a hospital for the first years of his life.
Years ago, a great doctor made the difference in my life. When he stood me up tall and straight for the first time on these artificial limbs I now wear. I could not pay his bill. But he told me that his bill would be paid if I would make the difference for one other individual, one other disabled individual.
In 1952, Dr. Viscardi founded Abilities Incorporated, the first business in the U.S. staffed almost entirely by people with disabilities. Using his influence and keen ingenuity, Dr. Viscardi demonstrated the value of disabled workers to various leaders and captains of industry, proving that a disability was in no means a liability in the workplace. At a time where most children with disabilities were relegated to hospitals and asylums and denied access to education and opportunity, much like Dr. Viscardi was, he aimed to create an institution that would provide a center of academic excellence and equality to children with disabilities of all ages. Once again, defying the odds and the stigma associated with disabilities, Henry Viscardi persevered, and in 1962 he founded the Human Resources School. Dedicated to providing equal education opportunities, the Human Resources School became the first of its kind, offering a complete educational and social experience to children with disabilities. Serving as an advisor to several presidents, Dr. Viscardi helped bring about reform and change, improving the lives of people with disabilities all over the world. In 1991, the Human Resources School was renamed the Henry Viscardi School in honor of its founder, and continues to this day to provide equal education and opportunities to children with disabilities. What once started as a small group of teachers and students has blossomed into a comprehensive institution of higher learning dedicated to providing its students with the best possible education.
Today we're here at the gracious invitation of our host, District Attorney Ann Donnelly. Here to introduce our District Attorney is one of my dear friends and colleagues, a historic advocate and leader in his own right, Ken Kunken. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about Ken. In 1977, Ken was hired by the Viscardi Center's Abilities Incorporated to be its college work orientation program coordinator, leading a program that provided educationally related work experiences for college students with significant disabilities. While working at the center, Ken became a nationally certified rehabilitation counselor. Wanting to accomplish still more, Ken enrolled in Hofstra University School of Law, where he earned a Juris Doctor in 1982. Ken then went on to work as an assistant district attorney in Nassau County. Ken has been promoted a number of times during his career with the district attorney's office, eventually becoming one of the deputy bureau chiefs of the County Court Trial Bureau, where he helped supervise more than 20 other assistant district attorneys. In addition, over his years working in the office, Ken supervised more than 70 student interns. In 1996, Ken received the Honorable Thomas C. Ryan Jr. Award, presented by the Court Officers Benevolent Association of Nassau County, for outstanding and dedicated service as an assistant district attorney, as an assistant DA. And in 1999, the George M. Estabrook Distinguished Service Award, presented by the Hofstra Alumni Association. Ken serves with distinction as a member of the board of Abilities Incorporated and its parent organization, the Viscardi Center. And speaking of parents, Ken and his lovely wife, Anna, are proud parents of 3 triplet sons, Joey, Timmy, and Jimmy. Please welcome my friend and colleague, Ken Kunken.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everyone. And let me add my welcome to everybody here, and thank you for joining us in celebrating the Americans with Disabilities Act, which many people, as you know, and as Chris just said, referred to as the ADA. Now, of course, being here in the courthouse, when I hear somebody refer to the ADA, they're usually talking about the Assistant District Attorney, of which I'm very proud to be one. And in my role as an Assistant District Attorney, I had the pleasure and the opportunity a little over 30 years ago to meet a young new Assistant District Attorney who had recently graduated from Fordham Law School. And I must say that when I met Ann Donnelly, I was immediately impressed with how thorough she was in both investigating and working up her cases, and how conscientious she was in handling a really heavy caseload. And anybody who's familiar with the workings of the District Attorney's Office knows it's a very busy place, frenetic at times with witnesses constantly approaching and asking questions and needing information right away and needing somebody to do one of 100 different things all at once. And Ann Donnelly never lost her cool. She was always very calm, very reassuring, and just inspired confidence in everyone, including her colleagues. And in addition, soon after she started working here, it was obvious to all of us that Annie was a very gifted trial attorney. When Annie was in court, she zealously prosecuted cases on behalf of the people of Nassau County, while never losing sight of the impact each and every one of her cases had on its victims and on the community at large. So there's no wonder that the voters of Nassau County recognized this, and this past fall overwhelmingly elected Annie to be our district attorney. So a few months ago, when we first started discussing the idea of having an event in the courthouse to celebrate the Americans with Disabilities Act, District Attorney Donnelly was very enthusiastic about the idea and immediately offered her assistance in any way that she could help. Because District Attorney Donnelly is not only concerned about keeping the citizens of Nassau County safe, but also in assuring our community is constantly working to increase its inclusiveness so that all of us can enjoy its services and its benefits. So it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our district attorney and my boss, Ann Donnelly.
Thank you, Ken. By offering my help, everyone knows all I did was lend him Dan Looney. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge some of the people who are here today. Our County Executive, Bruce Blakeman, the Office of Court Administration, who helped us get this event together, Judge Pipia, James Weisman, and from the Viscardi Center, Dr. Rosa, Board Chair Roy Danis, and the students of the Viscardi Center who joined us today. And of course, I have to thank my friend and colleague, Dan Looney, for putting such a wonderful program together. Ken Kunken has distinguished himself in our office as a trial attorney and supervisor. He was my boss a while back, and what a great mentor and supervisor he was. As a matter of fact, next week, our friend Ken Kunken will celebrate 40 years at the DA's office. Yes. Thank you, Ken, for being a great teacher and a great prosecutor. So we're here today to mark the 32nd anniversary of the day President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. Unfortunately, the pandemic prevented us from celebrating the 30th anniversary. In the bill signing ceremony on the White House South Lawn, President Bush said, "With today's signing of the landmark Americans with Disabilities Act, every man, woman, and child with a disability can now pass through once closed doors into a bright new era of equality, independence, and freedom." It is fitting that this celebration take place here in Nassau County. There have been trailblazers over the decades who have helped create a better and more accessible America, and many of them came from Long Island. One of the leading advocates for people with disabilities was a young man named Dr. Henry Viscardi, who we just saw that wonderful video about. 40 years before the ADA was enacted, Dr. Viscardi founded Abilities Incorporated, a business that almost exclusively employed people with disabilities. Through sheer force of will, in 1962, Dr. Viscardi went on to establish the school that now bears his name. Dr. Frank Bowe of Hofstra University is known as the father of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. In 1973, this groundbreaking law, and the predecessor to the ADA, guaranteed that no person with a disability could be excluded from, denied the benefits of, or subject to discrimination under any program that received federal money. And it is because of their hard work and so many others that we are here in celebration today. The ADA has personally helped my family. My son Jack was born at 25 and a half weeks, and he weighed 1 pound, 12 ounces. As he developed, we realized he was going to face challenges. He was nonverbal until the age of 5, and is now a developmentally disabled adult on the autism spectrum. But he has thrived under the programs and opportunities afforded to him because of the ADA. As we move forward, hopefully, to job training and group home living for my son Jack, I appreciate the equities the ADA has provided for him and so many more people. Thank you for being here today. And let us remember that while we are celebrating 32 years since the ADA was signed into law, there is still much work to do, and we can do it together. Thank you.
Here at Nassau County, the commitment to equal access, opportunity, and the full participation of people with disabilities in community life begins at the very top. We are very, very fortunate to have a stalwart, valued-centered leader like County Executive Bruce Blakeman, leading the charge for equal access and opportunity for the county's more than 250,000 residents with disabilities. He is no stranger to us at the Viscardi Center, and this April kicked off our press event and our pep rally announcing the joyful return of the Nassau County Games for the physically challenged. And County Executive Blakeman has committed that next year it will be bigger and better than ever. Please join me in welcoming our champion, Bruce Blakeman.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that kind introduction, and I want to thank our great District Attorney, Ann Donnelly, for hosting us today, but more importantly, for everything she does every day to keep the residents of Nassau County safe. Thank you, District Attorney Ann Donnelly. I also want to thank our Chief Judge, a great guy, Vito DiStefano, who couldn't be with us today, but Vito is an old friend, and he's someone who really takes all the challenges of Nassau County residents to heart. And thank you again for making this beautiful courthouse available to us. I want to thank my former counsel, Judge Rob Pipia. Rob was my counsel over 25 years ago in the town of Hempstead. And as you can see, his wise counsel and clear guidance has kept me out of trouble. And I think I owe a debt of gratitude to you. I don't think I'd be county executive without you today, Judge. Thank you so much to Rob Pipia. And again, Chris, thank you so much for all you do for the Viscardi Center and for the physically challenged and disabled throughout Nassau County and the whole region, the whole metropolitan area, the tri-state area. Roy, again, thank you for all you do. We really appreciate everything. And I just want to introduce my team. I have my Deputy County Executive, my Commissioner, and my Director here today as well, who are zealous advocates for this cause. So thank you for all you do for the county residents each and every day. And as was mentioned, one of the first approaches that I had after becoming a county executive was, are we going to have the games for the physically challenged in Nassau County this year after 2 years of coronavirus pause? And I said, absolutely. And as a result, we had thousands of athletes, world-class athletes, from the whole tri-state area. They came from upstate, Connecticut, New Jersey, Westchester, Suffolk County, New York City. And they all came to our Mitchell Field complex, and what I can tell you was one of the best sporting events I've ever been to. And I have to tell you, if you get a chance next year, go out to the games for the physically challenged. You will have a great time, and you will see really great competition, and the joy that you see on the faces of these athletes as they compete is something that you will cherish for the rest of your life. So we're here today for the 32nd anniversary of the passage of an act that, as Chris said, is something that leveled the playing field and made it clear that in America, everybody should get an equal opportunity, not just the able-bodied. And I think this act was so important because it set the bar. But as Chris said, this is the beginning. You know, it may be 32 years that the act was passed, but the fact of the matter is we have a lot of work to do. And the work that's being done here in Nassau County at the Henry Viscardi Center is world-class education and opportunity for our young people throughout the whole region. My friends are here today from the center. It's so good to see you again. I love it. I love going there because the professionalism, the quality of education, the kindness, the care, the love that goes into each and every student is really gratifying. It'll make you a better person if you go visit there because you feel really good when you leave there that great things are happening. So we are so proud to have that facility here in Nassau County, and I am committed to working with the board of directors on making sure that we increase all of the activities at the center because it's something that we in Nassau County can be so proud of to have something like that in our county. So again, I want to congratulate everybody. I think that the fact that we're here 32 years later to celebrate this first step that was made is really important, but we can't rest on our laurels. And I can assure you that so long as I'm Nassau County Executive, that we are going to continue to work hand in hand to make sure we do a better job and that we have bigger and better events so that we can make sure that all of those get to share in the opportunity here that we have in Nassau County and in this great country. God bless you all, and God bless the United States of America.
Thank you so much, Executive Blakeman, for your leadership and your friendship. It is my honor to introduce a dear friend, a colleague, and my mentor certainly in disability advocacy, but in life, the Honorable Robert E. Pipia. After graduating from Hofstra University Law School, Judge Pipia passed the February 1993 bar exam and was admitted to the bar in July of 1993, but only after he was forced to file a federal suit against the New York State Board of Law Examiners for violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, when he was denied reasonable testing accommodations. This action brought to light the serious pattern of discrimination which the bar examiners had followed and sparked a federal investigation by the U.S. Justice Department. Judge Pipia served as counsel to the Hempstead Town Board, Deputy Town Attorney, the town's Americans with Disabilities Act Compliance Coordinator, and as Executive Assistant to Town of Hempstead Supervisor Kate Murray. A regional and national leader on behalf of individuals with disabilities, Judge Pipia has served as a member of the New York State Rehabilitation Council, serves as a board member of the Viscardi Center, and is a trustee of the Henry Viscardi School, of which he's a distinguished alumnus, and as a national board member of the Muscular Dystrophy Association. He and his wife Maggie are featured in an exhibit at the President George W. Bush Library in College Station, Texas, highlighting in a video about the impact of the ADA, which was enacted, of course, during the Bush administration. In November 2014, he was elected judge of the Nassau County District Court, where he continues to serve with distinction. He proudly serves on the Nassau County Equal Justice in the Courts Committee and on the New York State Courts ADA Committee. Please join in welcoming Judge Rob Pipia.
Thank you very much, Chris. And Chris and I are very good friends. I'll pick up dinner next time, Chris. You'll know that. Just not that very expensive bottle of Chianti you like at King Alberto's. I will tell you, all of those things that Chris talked about my career and how I became an attorney and how I became a judge, you know, that's a long road, but when you don't have people around like Nassau County Executive Rosa Blakeman and others to give you an opportunity to actually go to work, perform, show people what your abilities are, it's meaningless. So I thank you, County Executive, for that opportunity. It's probably the reason why I'm a judge today. All right? As I said before, Judge DeStefano was not able to make it today. He had a personal issue to attend to. But he wanted me to read remarks that he had prepared in his stead. I'll do that now. Good afternoon and thank you. On behalf of the New York State Courts, let me again welcome you to the County Court. Many thanks to District Attorney Donnelly and to others for organizing this event. It is a great privilege to be with you today to commemorate the anniversary of the enactment of the historic Americans with Disabilities Act. Historic because with the enactment of the ADA, the United States became the first country to pass comprehensive protections for the basic civil rights of people having disabilities, outlawing discrimination against them in schools, employment, transportation, and elsewhere. Sadly, the history and societal treatment of disabled people has been alternatively marked by ignorance and intolerance, callousness and cruelty, and paternalism and pity. In signing this legislation in 1990, then President George H.W. Bush analogized it to tearing down the Berlin Wall, which stood, for those who remember, as both a physical, philosophical barrier to freedom. In the same way as the President noted, generations of Americans with disabilities were separated from freedom that they could glimpse but could not grasp. The ADA thus reflects the the significant milestone in implementing more fully the foundational principles of our great nation. First, that everyone is created equal, and more fundamentally, that everyone has the God-given inalienable right to be treated with dignity and respect. It is not coincidental that these fundamental principles are at the heart of all of the New York State Court's initiatives in regard to excellence, equal justice in the courts, and access to justice. Whether it is improving signage around the courthouses, providing essential information and forms, enabling computer or remote access to court proceedings, establishing help centers, initiating an online accommodation request service for people with disabilities, and facilitating essential services, including accessing vitally needed legal representation, the courts, are constantly striving to give people the tools, not to achieve a particular outcomes, but to have their cases heard and resolved fairly. Today's celebration in our county court is not only appropriate, therefore, but is also a necessary component of those most important initiatives. Thank you again.
Thank you, Rob, very much. It is now my honor and privilege to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker, James Weisman. Jim Weisman is an iconic leader within the disability rights movement, a path-breaking disability rights lawyer, and president and CEO emeritus of United Spinal Association, a nonprofit organization dedicated to enhancing the quality of life of people living with spinal cord injuries. 11 years before the passage of the ADA, Jim sued New York City's transit system and won bus access, key subway and rail station access, and the creation of a paratransit program. He also sued Philadelphia's transit system, yielding similar results by 1988. Jim was a key negotiator with Congress, promoting the passage of the ADA. The Act's transportation provisions applied the agreements in the New York City and Philadelphia agreements to the whole country. He was a founding board member of the American Association of People with Disabilities. His suit against New York City for curb cuts has resulted in a $300 million expenditure to date and an anticipated $1 billion during the next decade. United Spinal, under his leadership, was also successful in getting New York City's yellow cabs to be 50% accessible by the year 2020. Aside from all his considerable accomplishments and advocacy, Jim is the unequivocal keeper of the oral history of the modern American disability rights movement. He is a direct connection, a direct line to the most stalwart leaders in our field, and we proudly count him among their numbers. Please join me in welcoming our hero, Jim Weisman.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, District Attorney Donnelly, and County Executive Blakeman, and Rob and Ken. Your Honor. I knew him when he was a law student. We actually argued when he was a law student. I'll never go in front of him again. The greatest honor of my professional life has been to have been involved with the Americans with Disabilities Act. I played a small role in its passage, but it's still the highlight of my professional career. On July 26, 1990, on the South Lawn of the White House, I watched President George Bush sign the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. The ADA, the Emancipation Proclamation for People with Disabilities, was passed in 22 months, despite its controversial nature, with bipartisan support. The ADA is a guide for right-thinking people about how not to discriminate on the basis of disability. Perhaps its greatest benefit was the creation of a collective consciousness about the needs and rights of people with disabilities. The ADA changed American jurisprudence. Until ADA, non-discrimination required merely passive behavior, refraining from treating people differently because of their status, such as race, religion, national origin, gender, usually meant people were behaving in a non-discriminatory way until ADA. Merely requiring equal treatment for people with disabilities would not have encouraged employers to reconsider job requirements and determine whether applicants with disabilities can perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. The ADA made it a discriminatory practice not to make reasonable accommodations so that people with disabilities could find jobs. Employers may have to act, not just behave passively, or they may have discriminated on the basis of disability. So do places of public accommodation, whether privately operated or operated by entities of state and local government. Barriers wouldn't have been removed and transportation not made accessible if the non-discrimination mandate didn't require it. The ADA also raised the expectations of people with disabilities. For generations, people with disabilities were ignored, overlooked, and shut away by families, social services agencies, and government. People with disabilities now expect to compete for the same jobs as their peers, to have new construction and renovation be accessible and usable, and to be able to shop, recreate, and travel in a user-friendly environment. But all too often, their expectations are undermined by non-compliance with ADA. People without disabilities, too, expect the same and wonder why so much of the built environment remains inaccessible. In 1977, I ran to an old friend in Manhattan. It was in the days after disabled demonstrators, after months of cajoling, persuading, and picketing, got Jimmy Carter's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Joe Califano, to sign the first set of federal non-discrimination regulations outlawing disability discrimination. My friend Paul Hearn, a graduate of what is now called the Henry Viscardi School in Albertson, and of Hofstra University and Hofstra Law School, had osteogenesis imperfecta, a brittle bone dwarfing disease. I was a new lawyer, and Paul had been out of law school for 1 year and was being carried up a flight of steps every day by his co-workers at a Brooklyn Poor Person's Legal Services office. I pointed to the article in the Times about the new regulations enthusiastically, and he said, "It's just a piece of paper, it's not going to change my life." Even after knowing him 10 years, since we were teenage counselors at a day camp for kids with disabilities at Viscardi, I was shocked at his dismissal of this early disability rights victory. For the first time in our lives, despite my knowing Paul and other Hofstra students with disabilities had to demonstrate to be allowed to live above the first floor in their dormitories. And even though when we went into a bar or restaurant, the staff would instruct me to put him over there. And even after attending law school, I never thought there ought to be a law or a lawsuit to stop this behavior. We decided to work together and wrote a grant proposal for the Legal Services Corporation. 19 out of 21 New York City Poor Persons Legal Services offices were inaccessible to people with disabilities. We proposed the creation of a separate accessible office to handle traditional poverty law cases for people who couldn't use the inaccessible offices. Incredibly, Paul was able to wrangle us a meeting with Senator Jacob Javits in his New York office. Driving up 3rd Avenue in Paul's battered old car that he kept on the streets of Manhattan, he turned to me and said, "Watch this. The negative presumption will work for us. I'll roll into Javits' office and shake his hand. Then he'll talk to you because I'm in a wheelchair. When I speak up and I'm only as articulate as you are, Javits will overreact, feel guilty he dismissed me, and act like I'm a genius." That's exactly what happened. The meeting went as if Paul scripted it. Javits told us he was appalled by the need for the demonstrations to get Secretary Califano to sign the non-discrimination regulations. He was shocked that Vietnam veterans were throwing Purple Heart medals back over the White House fence to dramatize their plight. Senator Javits and Congressman Mario Biaggi of the Bronx got behind our grant proposal. Incidentally, we had to carry Paul up a flight to meet with Congressman Biaggi in his district office in the Bronx. And Biaggi said, I've got it. We'll get a daily news photographer. We'll do a tour of the legal services offices. You'll be at the bottom of the steps, and I'll be with you, and they'll take our picture. And we said, but Congressman, your office is violating the same law. All right, okay, forget the We got the grant. We got the grant, access to a law library, and opened the doors. In came the landlord-tenant disputes, the government benefits appeals, and domestic relations matters that 2 new lawyers were only barely prepared for. But in also came complaints like, they won't let me use a public pool because of my disability. They are charging double for my dorm room because my wheelchair takes up too much room. They wouldn't sell me a ticket to a singles dance because I use a wheelchair. And of course, transit is inaccessible. So are stores and theaters and apartment buildings. There are no curb ramps, so I can't get off my block. During the fall of '77, leaders of Disabled in Action invited me to accompany them to a board of directors meeting of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. In their testimony, they were going to suggest that a planned purchase of minibuses for Staten Island include lift equipment for wheelchair buses, for wheelchair access. 3 or 4 were called to the microphone to speak. The MTA board behaved that the speakers with disabilities weren't there. Except for the chair, who remained at the microphone, board members got up, visited the restroom, refilled coffee cups, talked among themselves, and ignored speakers. It got under my skin and stayed there for many years. I told Paul about the meeting the next morning. He said, you take transportation, I'll do employment, as if we could really do something. In September '79, working for Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, which is now called the United Spinal Association, that's right, I'm still there 43 years later, we filed a complaint using the New York State Human Rights Law, which had been amended in '74 to prohibit discrimination based on disability. Our position was that since the law prohibited discriminatory acts, when MTA purchased the bus, it was acting. In order to act in a non-discriminatory way, the MTA had to buy a bus that everyone could use, not just people who could walk. The same was true about station renovations, we argued, and the construction of new stations as well. New York City's disability community rallied around transit access advocacy. Blind people who had been transportation trained in New York City for decades and were using the subway and buses without accessibility improvements joined our effort. The politicians' reaction to the suit seeking access to bus and rail systems was a warped cost-benefit analysis that led to the conclusion that it was not worth it. This infuriated people with disabilities because it sounded a lot like you're not worth it. It was a negative statement about the relative worth to society of an expenditure that would elevate the lives of people with disabilities. The MTA board opposed accessible transit, as did the entire New York City Council except one person, she was the only exception. All Democrats, 100% Democrats, by the way, at the time. Worst of all, the newspaper editorial boards treated transit access just like Mayor Koch and MTA board chair Richard Ravitch wanted them to, as an expensive folly. Koch and those opposed to accessible mass transit all over the country promoted paratransit as a cheaper alternative. We asked, how could a duplicative system that needs new fuel, new operating personnel, and new vehicles be cheaper than just installing lifts on the existing buses? The newspapers sided with politicians against people with disabilities. We got an injunction preventing subway renovation at 10 stations unless elevators were included. The New York Times wrote a scathingly critical editorial of the court's decision, even including this phrase, there's a wheelchair on the tracks. In 1984, we prevailed. Governor Mario, forced MTA to settle with us. Lifts on all new buses, key station subway access, and paratransit for those who couldn't use mass transit despite their disabilities. Philadelphia people with disabilities wanted us to sue SEPTA, their transit authority, and by 1988 we had settled for similar results as New York City. Lifts on buses, key station access, and paratransit. In 1988, the ADA was being drafted by the National Council on Disability at the instruction of President Ronald Reagan. His administration was opposing, however, quite a bit of what the ADA required, especially accessible mass transit. No explanation for that. The staff director of the National Council on Disability was my old friend, Paul Hearn. And I worked with him and his staff to finesse accessible transit into the first draft of the ADA. I was involved in drafting and lobbying for the passage of the ADA. Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa led the Senate effort. His counsel, Bobby Silverstein, also a Long Islander, was the Senate architect of the bill, negotiating directly with the White House over key passages and ultimately being screamed at by the President's Chief of Staff, John Sununu. Silverstein won the argument with Ted Kennedy's help. The transportation requirements of the ADA are based on the settlements agreements with the United Spinal Association, not because the agreements were optimal. We would have much rather, for example, made all stations accessible, but even the most supportive politicians would not commit to all stations. And we had to get New York and Philadelphia congresspeople. We had to get New York and Philadelphia congresspeople to believe that the ADA would require nothing more of their transit systems. Otherwise, they would have helped Boston and Chicago, the two other old rail cities, oppose accessible mass transit. Once transportation accessibility was agreed upon in Congress, the last major hurdle to ADA's passage was overcome. Just a few weeks ago, 32 years after the passage of the ADA, and 43 years after we sued them, the MTA finally committed to 95% subway station access by 2055. I plan to be at the ceremony. 32 years ago, I arrived at the DC airport and told the cab driver to take me to the White House. Of course I felt important. Gatehouse personnel directed me to the South Lawn. When I came around the corner of the White House, I was struck by the sight of hundreds of people with disabilities who had waited millennia for this moment. President Bush sat on a raised platform, and among the dignitaries with him, who would receive a pen that actually signed the act, was Reverend Harold Wilkie, a bilateral amputee at the shoulders. He had no arms. From behind the president, he stepped forward when it was his turn to receive his pen. The crowd gasped as he took off his shoe and took the pen from the hand of the President of the United States with his foot. For me, this is the metaphor that's lasted all these years. Just because you can't do it that way doesn't mean that people with disabilities can't. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jim. I had spoken about this day with great anticipation with our remarkable student leaders at the Henry Viscardi School. They were excited to attend, but they wanted more. These are their heroes. The history that Jim just recounted is the history that they study in the strands of their disability history and disability studies curricula. Judge Pipia and Ken Kunken are the heroes that they claim. And so we didn't want to miss the opportunity of having them all here together on this historic occasion, on this stage, without the opportunity for them to ask them some questions about the ADA and its significance. So with your patience, our Henry Viscardi student leaders are now making their way to the stage. Just please give us a moment, and it'd be my honor to introduce them and to turn the floor over to them to ask questions about the ADA and its significance to our distinguished panelists. And our moderators for this afternoon's panel are to my left, my dear friend and colleague, Kyle Griffin. Kyle, raise your hand. Raise your hand. And Yasmin Murchison. Yasmin, welcome. Yas and Kyle, the floor is yours.
First question is for all. The Nassau County Court House and District Attorney's Office have made groundbreaking disability inclusion efforts over the years. What accommodations were made for you and the courtroom and DA's office that will lead the way for future attorneys and judges with disabilities going forward?
I'd like to start by addressing that. As you heard, next week will be 40 years ago to the day that I started working here in the Nassau County District Attorney's Office. I went through 3 years of law school at Hofstra. I took and passed the New York State Bar exam, and I started work here going through a very intensive 4-week training program that taught us all aspects of trial techniques to be a prosecutor. And I must say, I very proudly went to court my first day, and I couldn't fit through the swinging doorways in the court. They were too narrow to let me get through in my electric wheelchair. 40 years later, every courtroom in Nassau County, in New York State, in America, is now accessible. And in fact, in Nassau County, Judge Pipia, sitting to my left, presides over one of those accessible courtrooms. What could be better than that 40 years later?
I would say that with Ken being a mentor to me, because in the first summer of my law school career, I was an intern in this building. I was in the courtroom just above this courtroom on the second floor. And I was able to access that courtroom because of Ken being the frontier person that he was, and a person that came before me. But, you know, if you look at it, as Ken has put it, now I preside over one of those courtrooms. The courtrooms weren't made accessible, all the courtrooms weren't made accessible for judges. And when I was elected, it just started happening, you know. And to Judge DeStefano's credit and the Deputy Chief Administrative Judge of New York State, Norman St. George, who was my supervising judge at the time, many courtrooms were made accessible for me so that I could have the full experience of a district court judge. And that's a very important turnaround, because I see some of the young students from Viscardi who have been in my courtroom, who have been in my chambers, as my wife Maggie's class had visited our courtroom a couple of times. I want them to be accessing the bench, you know, 10 or 15 years from now. That's what I want to see. That's my hope, that's my dream.
Nassau County also recently, as a result of the district attorney's efforts, made a totally accessible grand jury room on the 3rd floor. That's accessible not just for the grand jurors, but also for the ADA, and even in the witness box being totally accessible. So they're constantly making improvements, and it's something I think we can all applaud. So thank you.
And we can also arraign anyone with a disability as well who commits a crime. That's a part of it. That is a part of it. It's equal access to the courts, and everyone can bring their case to these courts and have them fairly adjudicated.
This question is for all of you. Dr. Viscardi Center was a member of the disability community himself, a world-renowned advocate for the disabled, and a disability advisor to 8 U.S. presidents. He established an organization in Nassau County that has become an educational and employment model for the world. What impact did Dr. Viscardi and his work have on you personally?
I'd like to start with that as well, if I may. I know you've heard a little bit about my background, but I was injured in 1970 playing football at Cornell University. Unfortunately, what added to my misfortune was it was 20 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. I knew that as a result of my physical limitations, I had to go back to school and get the best education possible. So shortly after I was discharged from the hospital, I returned to Cornell University to resume my studies. Now again, this was 20 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act. There was not one ramp or one curb cut on the entire campus. One of my classes, which met 3 times a week, had 16 steps in front of it. And my dorm room was in a building that had 10 steps. On my first day of classes, I had to be either pulled up or bounced down close to 100 steps just to attend my first day. The Americans with Disabilities Act has changed all that. I visited up there 10 years ago. Every building now has ramps and there are curb cuts at every intersection. But let me just tell a little bit further about that. I knew that what I really wanted to do was going into a career where I could help others. So after I got my undergraduate degree at Cornell, I stayed at Cornell and got a master's degree in counseling. And then to increase my credentials, I went to Columbia University and got a second master's degree in psychological counseling and rehabilitation. So when I started to look for a job, I was fairly confident that now that I had 3 degrees from prestigious Ivy League schools, that I shouldn't have much difficulty securing employment. No one would hire me. I looked for a job for more than a year and sent out more than 200 resumes. I was even turned down when I offered to volunteer my services. Finally, I had the fortune and good luck to meet one individual at one organization to give me the opportunity to show what I could do. That was Dr. Henry Viscardi, Jr. Dr. Viscardi hired me to work at Disabilities Act, which was part of what was then called the Human Resources Center, and is now named after him, the Henry Viscardi Center. He hired me to work as a vocational rehabilitation counselor, and for that opportunity, I'll always be grateful. I'm certain I never would have had this position as an assistant DA without first having that opportunity at the Viscardi Center. And I would just like to add that when I thought about considering going to law school, I spoke to Dr. Viscardi about it, and he not only encouraged me to go, he wrote a personal letter of recommendation on my behalf. So, Viscardi and the Viscardi Center has played a major, major role in my life, and I will always appreciate that.
I'm waiting for Mike.
Okay. What I would say is this: Dr. Viscardi did so much to me in my life. I was a student at the school, and Dr. Viscardi was very famous for saying that people with disabilities are ordinary people living extraordinary lives. And basically, he was telling us, look at all the people before you, people like Ken, people like Dr. Viscardi, did so much work throughout the years to really raise the lives of people with disabilities, that you should take it the next step further each and every generation. And that was the call that he made to many of the students that I graduated with, was to absolutely do your best and to be as resilient as possible and to keep on moving forward. That's why, as Dr. Rosa said, when I was told I would not be given accommodations to take the bar exam in New York State that I needed, I didn't stop at that. I didn't take that as the answer. Dr. Viscardi instilled in all of us that resilience to keep on moving and fighting and using ADA. And my friend to my right here, Mr. Weisman, was somebody I called right when that occurred. you're right in the middle of having to study for this god-awful exam, right? You know, you're in the middle of an exam, and now you have to go to federal court in New York City to try to do something. But you called somebody like this gentleman to my right, right, Mr. Weisman, and you asked him, "What do you think I should do?" And he pointed me in the right direction. It's a public interest firm that represented me, and that's the spirit of it, because it's people like Ken Kunken, James Weisman, Dr. Viscardi, that came before me, that gave me all of those, as Dr. Viscardi always said, the tools to go forward. So I can't think of any other better segue to move it over to you, Jim.
Wait, I'm on, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I always start my speeches with, this is on, right? Because I know it captures everyone. I knew Henry Viscardi since 1967. I was 16 years old. I was supposed to work at Wallbaum's on Willis Avenue and IU Willits Road. I biked over there my first Monday after school. I had to go to summer school if I didn't get a job. So I biked over there anxious to work, and the manager of Wallbaum said to me, "Oh, I forgot I promised you the job. I gave it to..." And that was it. I had no job. I biked home. I was sweaty and hot and miserable. And I was complaining to this girl that I was really hot for who lived down the block. And she said she was volunteering at this place, Human Resources Center, now called Viscardi Center, in a day camp for kids. And she goes, "You have senior life-saving, you may need a lifeguard." So I went to be the lifeguard. From the minute I walked in, my life was different. And I mean it. I had no friends or relatives that were disabled. I didn't think about disability. It was just not on my radar. But Hank Viscardi, he'd meet with us once a week in the mornings. He'd allow people to smoke cigarettes. I was 16. I wasn't smoking. He'd have coffee. I didn't drink coffee. He gave rolls and coffee and cigarettes out to the kids because he treated us like adults. And when the summer was over, which was just the most rewarding thing I'd ever done in my short life, I was walking past his office rolling this giant table that we used to use outside in the recreation center. And he said, Jimmy. And I didn't even know he knew my name. And I went in his office and he said, "Sit down." And he was this big shot to me. I mean, I was 16. And he said, "What did we do right and what did we do wrong this summer?" You can't not love a guy like that. He's advisor to 8 presidents and he's talking to a 16-year-old in a t-shirt about the summer camp. He'd give us lectures, these lectures every Friday with rolls and cigarettes and coffee. He'd talk about when he met this prime minister and that one, all famous people, and we all imagined the world becoming accessible to people with disabilities. We really could. He gave me that insight. He gave me that vision. And even when we'd argue, because I knew him forever, even when we'd argue, I always felt he respected me and what we were trying to do. Sometimes he thought we were overzealous and we should sell it a little softer, but he always was on our side. By the way, he was part of the National Council on Disability when Ronald Reagan told them, write a report about what people with disabilities need. And they wrote a report called Towards Independence. You'll see his name as one of the signatories. And it's a narrative version of what appears in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think about it almost every day. He's been part of my life for 40-something years, 50 years. So thank you.
Thank you.
This next question is Rob Pipia.
And Kyle, just that this has been wonderful discussion. In the interest of time, we're gonna use this as sort of the final question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Henry Viscardi School graduate Paul Hearn went on to co-found the American Associations of People with Disabilities, well, John Kent. It now has over 50 million members nationwide. What contribution did he make here in Nassau County?
He made the imprint that he made on just ADA, as Jim talked about in his speech. The fact that Paul Hearn was was instrumental in ADA. But the fact that he was an alumnus of the school that I went to made it such that much greater to me. You know, you always wanted to be like Paul Hearn when you were growing up. You know, none of us, you know, I mean, I would have liked to have been in the advocacy world, but I didn't have that opportunity. And there were the other opportunities that I took and ran with in life that brought me to be a judge. But I did do advocacy work a little bit here and there, and I work on it constantly as much as I can as a judge. So those are the things that Paul Hearn kind of like instilled in almost every student that's coming out of Viscardi.
Thank you, Judge. And let's have a big round of applause for Yaz and Kyle. It's been a wonderful afternoon. To close our program, it is my honor and privilege to introduce a remarkable value-centered leader who is deeply woven into the fabric of our disability community here at Nassau County. He provides visionary leadership as the Henry Viscardi Center Board Chairman. Please welcome my dear friend and colleague, Roy Dana.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me in the back? Sorry about the time. I have edited my comments down dramatically because of the lateness. I apologize. Thank you, everyone, for this great day. When you're the last speaker, you tend to have nothing to say because it's all been said, and I don't want to be the barrier between you and lunch, so I'll get through this quickly. As chairman of the Viscardi Center, I've developed an abiding appreciation for the crucial role that Nassau County's network of leading nonprofit organizations, colleges, universities, and county agencies play in empowering people with disabilities to live lives of independence, fully included in all aspects of community life. The Viscardi Center is proud to be part of this vibrant network, several members of which have joined us here today as exhibitors. So following today's program, please stop by their tables and say hello to these valued partners who are with us this afternoon. We have the Helen Keller National Center, Helen Keller Services for the Blind, the Nassau County Civil Service Commission, Able News, Free Family Residences and Essential Enterprises, Hofstra University's Disability Studies Program, North Shore Child and Family Guidance Center, the United Spinal Association, and Nassau Community College's Center for Students with Disabilities. I want to thank all of our exhibitors for coming here today. I do want to thank District Attorney Ann Donnelly for her support for today's celebration, for her leadership, ensuring accessibility and inclusivity applies to all Nassau residents, especially those with disabilities. Thank you to Judge Pipia. Thank you to James Weisman. That was a tremendous oral history. Chris is right. Dr. Chris Rosa, thank you very much for your leadership. Of course, Ken Kunken. I'll get to that in a second. And I do want to thank the Viscardi Day Happy Without Borders participants who are here but have to get out of here to catch their bus back to the center. So thank you all for attending. We're going to suspend the brief video, so we're going to pass on the Viscardi video if you don't mind. But I would like to bring Chris Rosa back to the podium for 1 minute to join me and Viscardi board member Ken Kunken for a special presentation. Kunken, you can stay right there. Chris.
One thing that we learned from Jim's oral history of the ADA and what's been written in Joe Shapiro's book, No Pity, is that the ADA was passed through a hidden army of advocates for social justice who were responsible for passing the ADA. And I think anybody who has come to know this building and the District Attorney's Office know that Dan Looney is a hidden hero, a hidden advocate for justice. He was the prime mover behind today's program, insisted that Nassau County residents with disabilities be fully included in the courthouse and the district attorney's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so on behalf of the disability community here in Nassau County, we'd like to thank Dan for his staunch advocacy and leadership, and ask him to please join us here for a brief presentation and a token of our affection. And Dan, you will learn what this is in this remarkably decorative case momentarily. As Roy, we have one more honoree.
Thanks, Chris. So in the spirit of full disclosure, Ken Kunken is my cousin. And yeah, so I could talk about Ken's successes and his fight to get acts like ADA passed and his activism over the years, but I know we don't have that kind of time. But Ken is the reason I got involved with the Viscardi Center years ago. And as he mentioned, in his early years, it was known as the Human Resources Center. In fact, I remember meeting Dr. Henry Viscardi one day when I visited Ken at the center. And it's a day I remember, gosh, I guess I hate to say this, but 50 years later, I still remember it. It's been that long. Ken mentioned his injury happened while playing football at Cornell University on October 30th, 1970. And as he mentioned, after a year of rehabilitation, he went back to the Cornell campus. And if you're familiar with Ithaca, New York, you know the winters are difficult to navigate that campus for able-bodied people, let alone someone in a wheelchair. And by the way, his injury predated, if I'm not mistaken, even electric wheelchairs. And I can remember quite vividly him going up and down stairs to get into lecture halls. And the ramp to his dormitory, which took a lot of arm twisting, was not an easy endeavor. Today, obviously, we see ramps in all these public buildings, but that was a challenge back then. Having doors widen in cafeterias, lecture halls, required significant efforts from numerous departments just to give Ken access to buildings that others took for granted. And he mentioned throughout his career, he's been advocating for people with disabilities to have equal access and inclusivity. And as he mentioned, after getting his career on track into the legal profession, he lands the dream job of his life here at the DA's office. And on his first day of work, he discovers he can't get through the court doors. So a lot has changed since those early years, but there's still a lot more to be done, obviously. But Ken was a pioneer. He was a pioneer for people with disabilities, fighting with, whether it was administrations, building maintenance departments, anyone who would listen on how important accessibility is for people in wheelchairs who want to go to school or work. Thankfully, 50 years later, since Ken's injury, we have made significant progress with the help of laws like the ADA. But Ken knows his fight is not over, nor is it for any of us working in the disability community. The passage of the ADA 32 years ago was a significant step forward. However, there's always more to be done, particularly in the area of employment, job training, transportation, etc. But thanks to advocates like my cousin Ken and many others, and to organizations like the ones represented here today, people with disabilities have a chance to reach their true potential and enjoy the highest quality of life possible. So along with my colleagues at the Viscardi Center, we would like to honor Ken today for more than 50 years of advocacy for the rights of people with disabilities and for his 40 years of service in the Nassau County DA's office. So Ken, congratulations. I'm proud of you. I always have been, you know that. And we're going to have the same presentation that Dan Rubin received to give to me. So Ken was obviously unaware we were going to do that for him, but certainly well deserved. I think that concludes our program.
The only thing I would add is to let our colleagues know what is contained in those beautiful baskets, if I may.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So, Viscardi is known for its social enterprises, and in the 1960s and 1970s, one of those enterprises was the production of etched glass, hand-etched by artists with disabilities. The Viscardi Center, Abilities Incorporated, had a contract with the White House to make exclusive etched glass commemorative items that American presidents would give to visitors to the Oval Office. They discontinued the practice after the Nixon administration, but in our archives, we have 383 pieces remaining. So in honor of Dan and Ken's remarkable, generous contributions to all of us, we're pleased to give them pieces of individually etched glass by artists with disabilities in celebration and honor of their remarkable contributions.
So on behalf of the Viscardi Center, Dr. Chris Rosa, our President and CEO, thank you all for coming today. Happy birthday to the ADA, and let's keep at it. Thank you.